Good evening. My name is Nancy Dallins, and I'm the Director of Education at the Tampa Bay History Center. Welcome to the kickoff of the 2023 Florida Conversations Lecture Series. I'm in Tico Hall in the History Center, and it's Wednesday, September 20th. We are live, but we're recording the program so that it can be watched from our website and our YouTube channel. So welcome to all visitors in person and virtual. We have a great program this evening celebrating the start of Hispanic Heritage Month with a special wonderful historian and friend of the History Center, Dr. Sarah McNamara. As you know, we have our museum store. Some of her books are still available. The store will stay open until 8 p.m. and she will sign books afterwards. Tonight's program is made possible by the Tampa Bay History Center Endowment Fund at the University of South Florida, also WUSF Libraries, AARP Florida, and WUSF Public Media. A huge thanks to these generous sponsors. Before we get started, I'll make a few announcements and then hand it over to Ms. Carmen Alvarez, the host for the evening. The History Center is located in downtown Tampa. We have 12,000 years of Florida history in beautiful galleries as well as interesting and fun programs. We have lectures, walking tours, adult learning courses, field trips, and tours. Please check them out on our website. We have 2 temporary exhibits that are still up, and they will be up until October 15th. We have Etched Feathers, the history of the printed bird for you fans of the artist John Costin, and Key West and the Florida Keys, mapping the history of the Conch Republic. So as for upcoming programs, we have an exciting schedule of Florida Conversations and evening lectures. Our next Florida Conversation program will be Wednesday, October 17th, featuring Fred Hearns, the curator of Black History, along with Robin Nye, the City of Tampa's Art and Cultural Affairs Manager, along with several guest panelists. They'll be talking about Tampa's Soul Walk. Soul Walk is a digital arts and heritage trail that spans 46 miles approximately in 25 neighborhoods and tells the story of Tampa's Black communities. On November 2nd, we will have our annual Nell Ward lecture. Our speaker is Dr. Matthew Edney. His talk is entitled Color Map Printing in the 19th Century America, and it'll showcase dozens of maps explaining the basic techniques for how they were printed and colored in the mid-1600s and how that technology advanced through the 19th century. And lastly, on November 15th, we will be joined by Dr. Brad Massey and Rodney Kite-Powell, historians here at the History Center. We'll look at Florida's history in the 1920s. That corresponds with 2 upcoming exhibits that'll open in early November. So we hope you can join us for these free programs. So tonight's host is Ms. Carmen Alvarez. Carmen is a Cuban-American book lover whose passion for books drove her to establish Tombs and Textiles on Instagram in 2015 and a TikTok on 2021. She uses her platforms to review and recommend books from across the diaspora and to push back against the lack of representation of Latinidad in traditional publishing. Outside of her passion for books and her underlying love of local library, she adores vintage fashion, going to concerts and films, and supporting local arts. Born and raised in Tampa, Florida, she resides here with her husband, Daryl, and 2 dogs. So we'll welcome Carmen, and she will introduce our other guests.
Thank you, Nancy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this night's event. This is my first time at the Tampa History Center as an MC, and I'm like boiling over with joy to host and MC this event. So not only is tonight the new season of the Florida Conversations, but it's the last major appearance and final book event of my good friend Sarah McNamara in the Tampa Bay area. This month is Latino History Month, originally known as Hispanic Heritage Month. For many of us who are writers, speakers, and those engaged with community, this month is both exciting and exhausting. To me, on my platforms, every day is a day to celebrate Latinidad. Latinas and Latinos represent nearly 20% of the United States population and have histories, politics, identities, and stories that are diverse and divergent as the cultures from which they descend. What I love about books, both nonfiction and fiction, is that through writing we can make sense of the complexities and differences of Latinidad as we invite people into our world. Sometimes writing provides a way for those of us within our community to understand the differences that make us big, messy category that we know. This evening's event is called Florida History is Latino History. Together, we're going to unpack and examine this idea through the work of Dr. Sarah McNamara, a Tampa native and Latina historian whose family is from Ybor City. I'm going to give you a little bit of what to expect tonight, and then I'll go ahead and introduce Sarah and James. Tonight's program is a book event and an author discussion. Of course, my favorite genre of events. Sarah will begin with a few words and a reading from her fantastic book. Trust me, I read it, and it's not because her mom's here. And then the book discussion will begin. We will end our event with a Q&A, book signing, and author meet and greet to follow. I'll give instructions to direct this at the end of the program. With that, let me introduce the stars of the show and begin the main event. Dr. James López has the honor of interviewing Sarah this evening. Dr. James López is professor of Spanish at the University of Tampa, where he founded and co-directs the Center for José Martí Studies affiliate. The CJMSA's dedication to the study and teaching of history of the Cuban émigré communities of the 19th and early 20th century has been recognized with major grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Florida Humanities Council. Professor López is also a scholar of Latin American literature and literary translation and was awarded the 2019 Louise Loy Hunter Award for Outstanding Faculty Member at the University of Tampa. He is the grandson and great-grandson of cigar factory lectores, or readers, and is the proud descendant of the founding generation of Cuban cigar workers in Ybor City and West Tampa. Welcome, Professor López. And of course, Dr. Sarah McNamara, whose work I know you'll love as much as I do. She's also a really nice person. I'm going to read Sarah's full bio so you know how impressive of a person she is. Dr. Sarah McNamara is a historian whose writings examine the histories of Latinos, women, and gender, immigration, and labor in the modern United States. She is a professor in the Department of History and core faculty in Latino and Mexican American Studies at Texas A&M University. McNamara is author of Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South, UNC Press 2023, as well as numerous articles and essays in outlets such as the Journal of American Ethnic History, Labor, Studies in Working Class History, South Writ Large, and others. In addition to traditional writings, McNamara believes community engagement is essential to historical work. In 2023, she unveiled the historical marker and mural project that commemorates the 1937 Women's March, Anti-Fascist Women's March, a project done in cooperation with Tampa artist and Cuban-American muralist, who is here tonight, Michelle Sawyer. Will you stand and just say hello? McNamara is a native of Tampa, Florida, and her family is from Ybor City. McNamara's work has received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Library Association, the American Association for University Women, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars of Princeton University, the American Historical Association, and the Tulane Center for the Gulf South. In recognition of McNamara's commitment to teaching and student mentorship at Texas A&M University, She has received the Montague Center for Teaching Excellence Award, the Early Career Teaching Award from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and Association of Former Students Distinguished Achievement Award for Teaching. McNamara regularly collaborates with community groups to coordinate history programs that range from historical photography exhibits to educational events for adults and works, K-12 curriculum development, and teacher training with organizations such as the National Humanities Center. Perhaps especially important to all of us, Sarah McNamara is a Tampa native and her family is from Ybor City. Welcome, Sarah. And just briefly, before the interview commences, Sarah is going to say a few words about Latino Heritage Month.
All right, everyone, I'm a bit shorter than Carmen, but we're still gonna make the stand work. First and foremost, let's give Carmen a round of applause. I know we're constantly applauding, but thank you all. It's hard to walk into a space that you're unfamiliar with and meet a bunch of people, and she does it with such grace every time, and she's such a joy to work with. I hope that you all will find her and follow her on her platforms. She has so much to share and learn, and I have dove into the world of Latina romance novels due to Carmen, and it's captured my heart. Because even though I'm an academic and a historian, I spend all of my free time reading nothing that has to do with the things that I spend the majority of my life reading. All right. So like Carmen said, this month it is complicated, right? It can be exciting and exhausting, but it also asks us to think about the heritage of Latino history. History months exist because they seek to centralize stories that are too often marginalized. The history of Latinas and Latinos in the United States is one of those histories and of those paths. If we put that reality aside, Latino History Month, and really any history month that we have, provides an avenue for us to imagine what history and perhaps even our society may look like if the marginal were not marginal, but a part of an accepted reality that the United States is not and has never been a place with a singular past, culture, politic, or identity. The name of this event, right, the title, the theme that we are going with is that Florida history is Latino history. Florida is a part of that shared path that encapsulates so many of those complexities. One of the most renowned historians of Latinas in the United States, Vicky L. Ruiz, she once wrote an article and delivered a speech at the Library of Congress that declared that Latino history is US history. That might seem kind of common at the outset, but this concept was so revolutionary. It's a part, aside from her work that reaches volumes, it's one of the things that propelled her entry into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which requires presidential nomination. What she meant by that is much more than what the title implies. Ruiz argued in those few words that the way we envision national histories is based on how we orient national pasts. And if we take history seriously, who is included and excluded in mainstream narratives is as complex as the very concept of who and what lays claim to the United States. Ruiz herself reminds us that the first European language spoken in what later became the United States was Spanish, not English, and that the first stake of colonization in the United States was St. Augustine, not Jamestown. These realities introduce and interweave Latino history with legacies that we oftentimes associate with the broader United States. Stories of political policy creation and civil rights. Stories that include colonial domination and societal creation. Those that interweave indigenous violence and indigenous survival, as well as the realities of racial inequality and the development of multiculturalism, as well as so much more. But when we think about Florida, right, this place that we all call home and that I still call home even though I'm in exile, it is impossible to understand Florida without understanding the state as a place defined by Latinidad. Whether a person's personal history or heritage is one connected to Latinidad or the ideas that this month celebrates, the reality is that all of our lives have been touched and shaped by Latino stories here in the state of Florida and throughout the city of Tampa. Latino history is not new, although the study of it is a bit newer than other areas. And the ideas that this month advocates isn't new either. Florida history is Latino history, and I'm excited to share a bit of my book with you to help us think about the meaning of this concept and the significance of this month. Thank you all.
Well, hello?
Oh, you got it.
Does it work? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I think that you're in for a treat tonight. Sarah's book is an extraordinary history. As someone who was brought up here in Tampa and was steeped in the history of our community, I thought I knew it all. And her book expanded my view of who we are and where we come from in ways that were unexpected and really enlightening and illuminating. And beyond just being an extraordinary work of history, and both in the macro sense and in the micro sense, it's also of great literary worth. It's a beautifully written book, and it's something that I think that to give you all a taste of that, I think it would be a great pleasure to have Sarah begin this event by reading a short excerpt from her book.
Thanks so much, James. You guys don't know how much that means. Academics are not known for writing well. We're known for writing smart things, but writing beautifully is not at the top of our list. But it was something that was important to me because I wanted my work to resonate with people beyond academia. Amelia Alvarez was born in Cuba when the island was a Spanish colony. Yet by Amelia's 9th birthday, her home as she knew it no longer existed. The Cuban War for Independence, which U.S. imperial ambitions turned into the Cuban, Spanish, Puerto Rican, Filipino, American War, brought an end to Cuba's colonial status, as well as Cubans' hope for a truly independent island. When Amelia turned 16, U.S. troops occupied Cuba for the second time in her life. That year, 1906, she boarded the steamship Olivet and sailed 110 miles from the port of Havana to Key West. Soft winds from the Florida Straits wrapped around Amelia as she passed through immigration and rested for a night. The next morning, she climbed aboard the same boat and journeyed another 250 miles northward through the warm waves of the Gulf of Mexico. Once the ship docked, Amelia descended the gangway and walked into Tampa, Florida. At the turn of the 20th century, Tampa brimmed with chaotic possibility. Sounds of Spanish and English hovered in the heavy, humid air as Amelia navigated the throngs of people who crowded the port. More than 100 passengers charged forward with their luggage in hand, while stevedores unloaded bales of Cuban tobacco leaves from the ship's hold. 30 years earlier, this swampy town featured little more than an obscure military outpost and a settlement of sweaty Confederates. But by the time of Amelia's arrival, the Cuban cigar industry had changed nearly everything. Black and white immigrants, primarily from Cuba, along with others from Spain, Italy, and Puerto Rico, collided in Tampa as they searched for work in the city's new cigar factories. Once hired, cigar workers stripped, sorted, and bunched tobacco leaves, then rolled, banded, and boxed cigars. The labor of these women and men transformed Tampa into the leading industrial center of the state, while their bodies, cultures, and politics created an international borderland in Jim Crow, Florida. On the dock, Amelia stayed near her family, for she had not come alone. Her sister and brother-in-law, their 2 children, and 3 aunts arrived together with $56 between them. As the family of 8 emerged from the bustling masses, they likely boarded a streetcar to carry them 6 miles down the road to their new home in a neighborhood called Ybor City. Thanks.
See what I mean? So to begin the conversation, one of the things that I found most interesting about this book is how you expand the history of Ybor City beyond the initial phase, and also how you are able to weave the history of your family, micro-histories, the histories of real people, and how those histories mirror the much larger societal changes that were taking place. And so I would like you, if you could, to provide us a little bit of insight into how you organized this book and how you structured that history.
So the structure of the book, what James is talking about, it follows the different phases of Ybor City. So the portion I didn't tell you about what I just read, Amelia Alvarez, the main character who opens the book, she is my great-great-grandmother. She is the first woman in my family to immigrate from Cuba to the United States and to come here to Ybor City. And she was coming with her family, and they were all relocating, although some stayed on the island. The idea of having a book, I wanted it to reflect the generational component that is the history of Ybor City. And James knows, his family's from Ybor City as well. Right, there's a reason that we always celebrate the early period of Ybor, and it's because it's incredibly inspiring. Right? It's incredibly inspiring to tell a story of the success of labor unionism and labor activism. It's incredibly inspiring to look at a community and the way that it's built. It's incredibly inspiring to look at a group of people who are able to retain control, advocate for themselves, and create a sense of Latinidad that is individual and that relies on community support. What's a bit less inspiring is what happens as those things fall apart. But if we look at the city of Tampa, if we look at the history of Ybor City, the story of Ybor isn't one or the other. It's a story that spans generations. It's a story that connects different generations. It's a story that connects different places and neighborhoods and identities. And that's what I wanted to do. The introduction to my book, the portion that I just read from you all, is called Searching. And I grew up with stories. I grew up steeped in the culture that is of Ybor City. The way that I write about it in the book is that my grandmother was on a one-woman mission, to be sure, and my sister, and I knew what it meant to be of and from Ybor. Right? So the ideas of celebrating certain holidays, ideas of certain political traditions, ideas of making sure that family was at the center and spending actual time in Ybor was something that was natural. But I only heard portions of the story. I learned about Amelia Alvarez for the first time when I was a teenager. I was in high school. I was about 16 years old. And my grandmother was talking about her one day, and she called me to her kitchen table. And there was this article in the Tampa, what was then the Tampa Tribune. And she draws these lines on this photo and points out the women in our family who are in this massive protest. And all that she told me about it was that this is Abuela Amelia, and here's her daughter, your Aunt Mago. And I knew Aunt Mago. To me, she was the woman who came up to me and pinched my cheeks and how I just wanted to get away from during Noche Buena. But I did not know her grandmother. I knew that she was her favorite grandmother, but I didn't know why. And my grandmother passed away before I was able to answer those questions. I also grew up with stories, and James and I were talking about this before we came together, about how adamant our family was about how Spanish we were. And as I started to write this book, I found how many people were born in Cuba and how many people were Cuban. And that didn't necessarily align with family stories, but how somebody self-identified changed and when that began to change. And that in and of itself is a story of anti-unionist action. It's a story of anti-immigrant action. It's a story of nativism. And it's a story of people changing themselves as a result of force. And so the organization of the book, it follows on one point, it follows the evolution of people. It goes as well as the city and the community. The introduction is called Searching. The first chapter is Building. The second is Resisting, right? Resisting as these forces begin to build, resisting things like the Klan and anti-unionism. It then turns into Surviving, what happens when the federal government gets involved. what happens when the federal government begins forcibly identifying people in Tampa who are of Cuban descent as people who they believed were here without authorization through the thing called the Alien Registration Act. And then what happens, how do they survive that? And it's a story of what I call remaking. And the book ends with finding and a picture of my mom as a child that we unpack to bring the story together.
A wonderful picture, by the way.
James loves the photo.
I do love the photo. Well, thank you, Sarah. So really, we're talking here about Latino history, and you know, we have this tendency to romanticize the past and to think of, you know, that founding generation as a sort of model society, that's our origins. But this story of Ybor City and the story of Latinos in Tampa is a much more complex story and a much longer story, a multi-generational story of assimilation, right? Of adapting, and when you assimilate, you gain things, but you also lose a lot of things. You selectively remember aspects of our past. And it's important, no, I think what Sarah does is forces us to look at that past in an honest way, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about that issue, no? What is gained and what is lost over those 3 generations that you follow?
You know, I was at an event last Friday, and I was asked by a person, you know, when does a person consider themselves fully assimilated? And I could tell they were asking it as a celebration, right? That the issues that once stood with us in the past don't stand with us in the present. But what I write about in the book is that the process of shifting a person's identity, especially within the city of Tampa, it had a lot to do with figuring out how to economically survive as a community and as an economy that had employed the majority of the people who lived here began to disappear, which meant that the economy that they depended on was no longer an option for them. It wasn't going to employ them. They had to figure out how to survive outside of Ybor City. But in the process of doing that, they gave up a lot of who they were. They encountered intense discrimination, and that intense discrimination had an effect on how they understood themselves, what they were proud of, and what they were afraid to share. It had an effect on politics. It had an effect on how people were willing to or not willing to pass down certain ideas to their children and what they sought to shelter. One great example that I see alive in college classrooms and is an endemic part of this history and is a portion of the book is that we think about language, right? When we think about the history of Latinidad, when we think about the history of Latinos and Latinas in the United States, we so often imagine that everybody speaks Spanish, that this is the thing that brings everyone together. I teach the history of Latinos in the United States almost every semester. Sometimes I get a little bit more variation, right? But, you know, I'm the one who's teaching it at my university, so I teach it often. And I would say about 75% of the students in my classroom identify as Latino. But when people walk in, very few people speak Spanish. And the stories in Texas are not dissimilar from the stories that I hear here in Tampa. We just don't often talk about. In the city of Tampa, one thing that was common, especially to young children, is that they did not speak English at home, right? Ybor City was a Spanish-speaking environment, right? Parents didn't speak English. It was rare for a child who was born in the 1930s to have a parent who had gone to school past the 3rd grade. One thing that was common is that students who spoke Spanish in classrooms, who did not have the ability to speak English, that they would be beaten, some would be locked in closets. And I write about a moment in the 1940s when this comes to a head, where a child is beaten so badly at school that the Board of Education in Tampa assembles immediately and passes an ordinance that this is no longer legal. But despite that, right, it teaches so many different things. There were also stories that were printed in the newspaper because you had Latinas who were mothers who were writing in, and they were talking about the way that teachers referred to their children, the words that they called them, the words that they encouraged other children in the room to call them. That process, right, we might not think about it as visceral, but it sticks with somebody in a way that is unforgettable. It teaches them that who they are or where they came from, that there's something bad about it. And the only way that they're going to survive is if they let it go. Right? So while we can think about the beauty of different things, and that certainly lived within it, what happened through the process of saying, I'm not going to be able to live and stay in this community all the time, there were so many instances like that, right? The idea in the story of education is just one. And those mothers from Ybor were not shy about writing to the newspaper about it. They write about it not just in La Gaceta, right? We would think about that it's only in Spanish language newspapers. Their audience, they know who their audience is, and they're writing in to what it was then the Tampa Daily Times. They're writing into the City of Tampa newspaper. They're speaking about this openly, and they're advocating. Because we think about advocacy as being perhaps those big moments, right, that I talk about, right, the big protests, right? Those are the moments that we celebrate. But they're also those small moments that those women identified during that period. But it affects how people understand themselves. So what James was getting at is that the process of moving from Ybor, finding jobs in the city of Tampa, right? Those moments when we're like, people made it. They made it, but it also came at such a huge cost. And that cost is something that we can't think about, that we don't often think about. So when I think to that question that I was asked at the event last Friday, my question is always, is that the goal? Or is the goal thinking of living in a place, be it the city of Tampa, the state of Florida, that accepts people for who they are as they are? For everybody becoming more generous, for everybody understanding that multiple forms of identity and multiple states of being, that something is not lesser than another. Because forcing leads to much pain and much forgetting. And so a lot of people forgot different portions of themselves even as they remade.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to delve into that painful aspect of forgetting for a moment, because I, in my own personal history, I remember very clearly, right here, growing up in Tampa, you were Spanish, right? You ate Spanish bean soup. You went to eat Spanish food, even though we listened to Cuban music and we danced salsa and we ate, puerco asado and frijoles negros and in the house, but we were Spanish, right? It was a way. And part of that, there's a very strong racial component in that. When we go back to that founding community, when Jose Martí was here and there was the anti-racist discourse, and you see the idea that it was a racial community in Ybor City, how after the war is over, after Martí's gone, and these communities have to survive in the Jim Crow South, how the racial element begins to form an important element in how these cultures define themselves, right? That some of these Cubans could then become Spanish, but other Cubans couldn't become Spanish, right? Because of the color of their skin. And how that original sort of dream of a unified working class Cuban community in Ybor City segregates in the South. And I think that's part of the story that you tell very well. And I was wondering if maybe you could develop that a little bit more.
I'm so glad you thought that. That's one of the things I always wondered. I'm like, I hope it gets across well. I was talking to somebody about the book a few weeks ago, and one of the things that we were saying is that at the heart of it, what it is showing in the midst of that process is that somebody can experience intense discrimination and prejudice and also imbue that onto others, right? Experiencing something or experiencing discrimination or experiencing prejudice or even racism does not separate you from, imparting or being a part of the same process. In different ways, in ways that we may not even think about or imagine. Because, right, that's one of the things that's so hard. It's so hard to look at your own personal past. It's so hard to look at yourself and to sit back and think, what processes and what histories was I a part of, or was my family a part of? What have I gained throughout this process? And I oftentimes think about the book and even my original trajectory in doing it. When I sat down to write this book, when I was a graduate student, I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I left UF. I was like, okay, I'm going to grad school. I walked in thinking that I was going to write this book about these badass Latinas. Like, that's what I was going to do. Like, they did these amazing things, and I was going to write this incredible story of resistance. And there's those moments in there. But there is one thing when I started diving in the early years that really stood out to me. In 1937, the year when the anti-fascist march happens, right? This year when you see people fighting against fascism, when women and people in Ybor City are identifying fascism not just as something that happens abroad, but they are ardently and openly identifying fascism as something that lives within the city of Tampa. They're saying that the way that the administration of the city operates, that it is restricting them, that it is limiting them, that it is intentionally marginalizing them. And they weren't wrong, right? There were things like the WPA that Latinas and Latinos did not have access to by the same proportion that people who were Anglo, right? There were people who left the city for the sole reason of going to places like New Jersey and New York where they could get access to those things. There's excellent stories from the WPA that were recorded about people caravanning together from Ybor up to northern cities in order to gain access to these things. But even in the midst of that moment, in 1937, when resources are strapped, what happens in that same year is that one of the first elected politicians from Ybor City, Alderman Pacheco, he assembles a petition, and he gets a good amount of people to sign it. And what the petition is asking is for the city of Tampa to forcibly segregate Ybor City, the district. It's asking for the city of Tampa to institute racially based segregation. And the same people who are marching against fascism are the same people who are signing their names on this petition. It took me years I wasn't actually looking for the document. I was looking for all sorts of documents. I was at the City of Tampa archives, and I pulled a bunch of boxes that had not been opened in a long time. It was a very dirty day. I was covered in dirt by the end of it. My arms were just covered. It was gross. But in the midst of me going through all these documents that were incredibly out of order, I found the actual petition. And I knew it existed because La Gaceta had written about it. But what I saw attached to the petition was even more interesting to me. It was that the head of the NAACP responded, and they wrote to Alderman Pacheco, and they said, essentially, paraphrasing, "What are you doing?" They're saying exactly what affects you is what affects us. And we are much stronger together than we are separately. Those in Ybor City, right? Pacheco does not respond, to the best of my knowledge. I did not find anything in the NAACP papers, right? I went back and looked. I did not see a report on it. But that's just one example, right? So the idea of what I'm getting at is that the idea of progressive politics or even leftist politics existing does not negate the existence of clashes, right? It does not negate that there are things that can differentiate people. In Ybor City, within the union, the CMIU, the Cigar Makers International Union, the predominant union that supported people, especially by the 1930s, the CMIU, unlike any other chapter in the South, was consistently integrated. Because in that moment, it worked to everybody's benefit to have more people who were part of a union who were separate. And that tradition carried over from Cuba, where people demanded that they have the right to organize together. But then, right, there was bending when it comes to mutual aid societies and social spaces, right? So thinking about these things, that there were contradictions when it came to race within Ybor City even before people moved to different areas. You can even track it when you're looking at where people live. You can track it when you're looking at how much money people were making. And you can also see what happens when you're looking at it socially, and especially when you're listening to the stories of Afro-Latinos who talk about what it meant to live in Ybor City. You get a different perspective, right, when you are looking at the Círculo Cubano than if you were looking at the Sociedad Martín Maceo. You get two different narratives of the same moment, and listening to that was really important. Because what we oftentimes think is that this issue of Spanishness, right? Or distancing from Cubanidad, or saying, right, that there is some sort of proximity to being Anglo within the city of Tampa to be accepted, that this only happened when people left. But there were kernels of it that existed before, and then it became a larger issue, right, as people left.
So in other words, it's part of the process of assimilation, right? It's sort of like the dark side of assimilation, shall we say, the side where, you know, that we try to hide, you know, in a way, and to ignore that part of what happened, which was a response, I think, also to the political pressure of being here in Tampa, right? The vigilante groups, a lot of people forget that, no? And you describe it very well in this group, that there was alliances, right, between the cigar manufacturers and the captains of industry here in Tampa, no? Financing and organizing vigilante violence against organized labor, and that it became a strategy, right, to you know, if you can't beat them, join them sort of attitude, right?
Exactly, right? When I give the example of Alderman Pacheco, if we also think about the context that I'm describing, what Pacheco is seeing is that Black communities are being marked as that they were being redlined. If you don't, redlining is something that began in the 1930s, which meant that they were being marked for raising, right? That it was clear that the city was establishing a plan and they were going to demolish these areas. And they directly abutted Ybor City. So you're thinking, how can my community survive? And this space and this community might be able to survive if it is not associated with the different elements that those who are in power in the city of Tampa align with not being worthwhile or worth surviving or worth saving, right? So in the midst of this, I tried to explain and understand and provide context to people on why people made the choices they did. Not just that this thing happened and this person is categorically awful, but how does somebody make this kind of choice? How can you be anti-fascist and sign a petition asking for segregation at the same time? Those things existed together, even though they seem to be a contradiction.
Thank you, Sarah. And another aspect, another part of this history that needed your lens, you know, that needed to be explained better. I'm sure everyone here has seen the famous picture of Jose Marti on the staircase of the Martinez Ybor factory. It's kind of like the Mount Rushmore of Tampa, Florida. That picture, right? But there's no women in that picture.
There's no women in that.
And so what you did is, in this book, which is wonderful, is to center the history of women. I had no idea the percentage of women in who were working in the cigar industry by the 1930s during its decline, and it completely changed my perspective of how Ybor City developed in the generations after the initial generation. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about centering women in the history of Ybor City.
The book and the idea to center women really began with the stories of the 1930s, because the 1930s are so important, right? Just as I said, we always talk about the early era. We don't like to talk so much about what happens after because it's not so much, right, a story that's very uplifting. It's a story of what happens after things start to fall apart. But in the midst of that, right, even as there's great change, there is oftentimes opportunity and new roles that people get to play that perhaps they didn't play earlier. And for women and for Latinas within Ybor City, that is certainly the case. Right? In the 1930s, women become the primary employees of Cuban cigar factories. The trend begins in 1929, but it really becomes noticeable by 1931. Because by 1931, the Depression had been with us for about 2 years. And by that point, manufacturers had to make decisions. Who's going to stay open, who's going to survive, and how are they going to do it? And the answer was to fire men en masse and hire women to do the same work for half the pay. And that is what they did. Right, so all of a sudden, you have women who are making cigars, and many of you in the room might have those stories. We have stories in my family. We know who was a great cigar maker and who continued to be a cigar maker until the 1970s, but was terrible, right? But they took up that helm, and they were those who were the primary breadwinners for their family. They were the ones who were bringing in the majority of the money. But the reality is that they were making half the amount of money that their husbands once made for the same work, which also meant that they weren't doing the additional labor of doing things like being a despalladora, Those are the people who are in the basements who would remove the stems from the center of a tobacco leaf. Yes, strippers. When I teach this or when I give a talk at a university, I always, do a great dance for them, and it gets a big laugh. Students love it, right? I'm like, stripper, not stripper. Right, so when we think of that's what they were removing, there's also a job called the boncheras. And they were people who were slightly higher paid, worked on the main floor, and they bunched the tobacco, right, to give to the hand roller to move the process along faster. So they're not doing that work and getting that pay. So families are receiving less money for the same labor. And that trend, right, it continues. Men begin to get other jobs. They get things like they become janitors. Many become janitors. Many go or try to work for the WPA but can't, right? Many, as a result, leave. And some families are living in two different places. It doesn't mean that the whole family leaves. Sometimes women are staying here with their children and they're working, and men are going to other areas where they can find work and coming back when they can, right? It creates a very different story. But by doing that, I was also just sitting there and thinking, the way that the book evolves is how this trajectory, moves. What does it look like if we tell a story of evolution and community through the eyes of women rather than the idea that if we're telling a story of many, that it has to be through the eyes of men? Right? So it's a story of community. It emerged from that moment of wanting to tell that, but also thinking of how things like gender and sexuality are as central to these processes that I talk about as the way that other historians have spoken earlier, right, as talking about politics or political economy, that there are ways that these things meld together. And if we look at women, we find them. And I also just, wanted to know who some of these women were, right? It's really hard to find the names of women. It's really hard to people a book with the names of women. And that was one thing that I worked really hard to do. And the names that you see in the book are more likely than not names of people who you would see as the first names that you imagine when you think of Ybor City. In part, that is because of their sex, but in some ways, it's not. It's because women as historical figures are incredibly hard to trace. It takes a ton of work to figure out who they were. It takes a ton of time to figure out who they were because there's not as many documents. And documents that do exist are buried or they're listed differently, even down to the census. Trying to figure out a woman's maiden name, on average, will take me a week, right? To go through all the different documents and to access it. And then I can put together her life and her story and her migration and where she was living and put all these different things together to be able to build a narrative. And doing that for the course of an entire book, it's exhausting, but I hope, in my mind, it was worth it because we know who these women were. So whenever possible, I give the names of different people.
I was so just happy to read in your book about the role of women in the labor movement, in resistance, because I grew up in my grandmother's house. She was a stripper, and she arrived in 1906. Never learned a word of English, but spoke Spanish and Sicilian because she worked in the cigar factories. And used to tell me the stories of the strikes, right? And how they had to make the soup kitchens and how they had to feed. And, and the story is always the heroic men who are not working, but the women were keeping the community very much together. And also, in many ways, were organizers of these strike actions, right? There's one anecdote you tell about the women with the wildcat strike, right?
Yes.
Who stand out and go to the men and go, what
are you doing? Why are you all still sitting down? Essentially is what they do. But the reason that they go and say, why are you still sitting down, is because the women who were strippers, what was happening in the city of Tampa around 1920 is that they're thinking about how can we save money? They're like, we can mechanize that job. That job can be mechanized. And the women who occupied these spaces and who had long occupied these jobs, they're saying, hey, we're paying dues to the CMIU. We're showing up when you're going on strike because you're upset about this thing. So this is happening to us, and you too need to stand up and say no. And all these women walk out, and not a single man follows them. So they go back in, and they go to the main floor, and they taunt and they yell at them until they walk out. They shamed them into participating in the strike. Because they're just sitting there saying, you know, like, listen, like, we are here too. Right? Because in the midst of what we're thinking about, right, as James was speaking, I can see everybody nodding, right? We expect women to make the soup. We expect women to keep the community together. We expect women to clean the houses, even in the midst of all of these things happening. But in that moment, as he's saying that, did you forget that they too were working in the factory, in the basement, right? They too were earning a specific wage. They were coming home and they were doing all of those things, and their husband was probably going to the cantina where he was hanging out with other guys. Giving speeches. Lots of speeches, hanging out, right? And she's sitting there at night and she's like, okay, I'm going to do all these things, and then I'm going to hang out with some women on the front porch at night, and I'm going to talk about all the things that they're not doing, right? So thinking and remembering all those things, the many ways that women work, the many things that it took to make community operate, and to think about all of those factors as being a part of cigar community making, right? Because some of the things that stood out to me also, right, we think about cigar making, right, that it was this big, empowering thing. I also write about people who hated it. They're just like, I hated this job, and here's what I hated about it, and it stressed me out, and I would dream about how much I hated it, and I was so glad when I didn't have to do it anymore, and went on to get different kinds of work, even within the community, right? So thinking about the experience holistically rather than romantically, because through that, right, we can walk through and understand a community for what it was rather than what we wish it to be. And if we only tell certain parts of the story, right, like Jose Marti, right. I'm not the first person to point that out, right? We have Lily Guerra, who wrote an entire book that's asking us to think about Jose Marti beyond the myth of the man, right? So thinking about that and remembering that is really important, and it's important to us to remember what the city is based upon, what the community is based upon, because then it makes more sense.
I'd like to maybe conclude with one idea, which is, so it ties into the women's history. One of the things that I most admire about Sarah's work is there's books of history, but it's a book, right? But she's succeeded in making this book a physical reality in our community, and led to the mural the beautiful mural that Michelle painted on 7th Avenue commemorating the 1937 anti-fascist Women's March here in Tampa. A bit of history that I was completely unaware of. I'd never heard of that march in my life. I was ashamed to admit that. And I think it's amazing, because so many academics, we write our book, and we put it, it goes on the shelf, and it's a bullet point in our CV, right? And we talk about it. And in this case, she's actually made a real mark in our city with this monument. How did that come about? How were you able to get that? Because I know it's not easy dealing with the bureaucracy in the city.
I didn't know how hard it was going to be when I started the project, and I will not bore you all with all of that. But it was much more of an endeavor than I thought it was going to be. I was on a walk one day, and I came back, I was like, Mom, wouldn't it be cool if there were a historical marker, a mural that had this element stand out? And she's like, please finish your book first. And I was like, okay. So the moment that my book went in, that the whole manuscript went in, I was finally happy with how it was written. I rewrote the thing 3 different times. And when James is saying, right, that it often just becomes a line in our CV, that's so true. I didn't have to share the book with community at all for me to do my job, which, fun fact of the day, I have to write a book on a certain schedule. It is my job. But I wanted the reason that I wrote the book to make a difference, and to make a difference in how we understand and how we think about history. I knew and understood that if I just wrote the book, that there was only a certain subset of people who would read it. I knew it would get assigned in classes. I knew that people who were in California would be reading the book. People in New York would definitely be reading the book. And that was one thing I wanted. I wanted people to know Ybor City existed beyond the state of Florida, because that's one thing. So many historians who've written about it have written about it in such a singular way, or that we often talk about it, that it doesn't resonate beyond, right? That it doesn't resonate beyond the state, and to reframe the history in a way that it can. But I also wanted us to think about how the lessons in the book really shape who we are. The majority of the historical markers in the city of Tampa are in Ybor City. And I had been walking through, and I was aggravated by them in a way. I was aggravated not that they were bad, but that the stories that were there were not the stories that you grow up hearing. They're not the stories that are foundational about how people thought. They're the stories that are unique oddities oftentimes that are, what make Latino history a novelty or entertaining to people. Like, Cuban bread was baked here, or, which is great. Or this person had this newspaper, but it doesn't say why the newspaper mattered, right? The bakery doesn't say why the bakery mattered, right? It just tells a tidbit. And there wasn't anything that had to do with politics. So I was like, there was a huge anti-fascist movement here. There were people who really believed in this, and they believed in it so much that they talked about that's how they understood World War II. When there were clashes of racial inequity that happened in the 1940s, people wrote about it in the newspaper as though the fifth column were rising, right? That this is not worth it because they are elements of fascism, right? So this was something that was so foundational. And I wanted us to think about women as political actors. I wanted us to think about the politics that shaped the city. And I wanted somebody to interact with it, even if they never knew this book existed. And that is what the project is and what it does. You can walk down 7th Avenue while you're walking toward the Columbia restaurant, and there is an historical marker. It's on 7th Avenue because in order to have a historical marker, it has to be in the place where it actually happened. And that's where it began. And there is a mural on the side that tells the story of that event. There is an image of women who are marching in the background. There are 3 different women in the foreground. One is a Spanish anti-fascist. The other is a labor organizer from Ybor City who thought about blending political work and labor work. She went on to create a national labor union. And then in the very front is an everyday woman from Ybor City, which Michelle wanted to include somebody who would have been one of the thousands who were in line, who were marching together. And the person who she chose was, ironically enough, when we think about how learning history changes what we think and what we know even about ourselves, the woman in the foreground is my Aunt Mago, the woman who I told you at the beginning I only thought about as being the woman who pinched my cheeks during Noche Buena. But it turns out she was a woman who marched with one of 5,000 other people in opposition to the rise of fascism here and abroad.
Well, the city of Tampa is much richer for your work and for what you've accomplished. And I believe now we are going to move to the Q&A, but thank you very much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure talking to you about
Thanks,
your
James.
book.